Hello, my name is Dr. Julie Jedlicka, and I am an associate professor in the biology department in the College of Science and Health at Missouri Western State University. And I'm here to talk with you today a little bit about my research. So I look at birds and how birds forage or consume different insects in agricultural lands. And this is a really fun research project because it allows me to look at whether birds might be consuming pest insects. And my students and I do research both in temperate areas, like in Missouri Western Campus, but also in tropical areas as well. So I started this research a while ago, and I worked on a meta-analysis with some co-authors. Meta-analysis looks at a whole bunch of literature and tries to see what the literature can tell us on how birds, in this case, and natural enemies forage in ecosystems. And so we were looking at the diversity of predators. Predators are organisms that eat other things. And what we found was that if you add more species diversity, more number of species to agricultural lands, you have a lower herbivore abundance. And this might mean pest abundance for farmers. So here's our meta-analysis that shows in agricultural lands, you get a mean effect size lowering herbivore abundance if you increase species diversity. So by adding diversity to our agricultural lands, we can maybe help control pest populations. And so I wanted to dive more into this and see, well, is it really true? Can we add more bird species into our agricultural lands, and do we get more pest control? So I wanted to look at ecosystem services like pest control for farmers, or potentially disservices. Do growers need to worry about adding more species diversity to their agricultural land? So this means we need to know, what are the ecosystem function of predators? How are they functioning in the ecosystem? Are they eating potential pest insects? Are they predators of herbivores? Or are they intraguild predators? So let me describe what that means. Let's say we are growing grapes, right? And so we want to maximize our grape yields in our agricultural lands. We know that pest populations, like this light brown apple moth, their caterpillars consume grapes, so they have a negative effect on plant productivity. But we also know that if we increase predators like this spider in our agricultural land, it will consume the pest, which consumed the grapes, so it will have a positive net top-down effect on plant productivity. So then we could say, well, let's add birds to our ecosystem. This is a bluebird. It too will eat the insect pest populations, so it could have a positive effect on grape production. That would be a predator of herbivores. However, the bird could also eat the spider, which was having a positive effect, so then the bird might have a negative effect on plant productivity. If it eats the spider, it's called an intraguild predator, consuming another predator. So really adding in more diversity of predators and more species richness of predators in agricultural lands has uncertain net top-down trophic effects on plant production. So we wanted to look at, what are birds eating when we add them into agricultural lands? Are they functioning to control herbivores, or are they functioning as intraguild predators? So we did this in a variety of different ways. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about using stomach content analyses to figure out what birds are eating, but also I'm going to talk to you about kind of a relatively new field, molecular scatology, that uses a fancy kind of DNA-based work with next-generation sequencing. And we'll go over 3 case studies looking at that in California vineyards, in Kenyan coffee farms, and at Missouri Western State University campus. But starting with stomach content analysis. So this is work that was done previously on shade coffee farms in Chiapas, Mexico. So Chiapas, Mexico is the southern state here in Mexico that borders Guatemala. And this research I was working on with an undergraduate at Missouri Western. And if we look at a bird's eye view of these shade coffee farms, shade means that the coffee farms have a bunch of shade trees. This is actually a bird eye view. You might think it looks like a forest, and that's because it does. Basically, the forest was left intact and growers planted coffee bushes in the understory. So this means that shade coffee farms really conserve a whole bunch of birds in Mexico, and thus they get labeled oftentimes as bird friendly. So this is a bird friendly coffee label from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. You could look for this when you buy your coffee and support conservation in agricultural lands. So we went to these coffee farms and we collected birds with mist nets, got stomach content from them, and then released them unharmed. So we caught 38 different bird species, and we had 1,173 different individuals. And again, we're looking at the ecosystem function or services these birds provide to coffee growers. And then we did some kind of fancy statistics. Permanovas are permutational ANOVAs that look at community level change as a result, in this case, of the diets of the birds. And what did we find? So here's kind of looking out at the forest and the coffee. This is the canopy layer where birds could forage up in the forest trees, or the understory. These are all coffee plants, right? So this is a coffee farm, and then you have some ornamentals, or they could forage an open scrub habitat, which is kind of more akin to our prairies, where they have more opening in the canopy and allows more sun to come in. So basically we found out that what birds were eating depended on their guild, whether they were strict insectivores, only relied on insects for their diet, or whether they were omnivorous, whether they consumed both fruit and insects. And then it depended on where they foraged in the coffee plantations. So were they in the canopy layer, were they in the open scrub layer, or were they in the understory? And again, canopy, scrub, or understory for omnivores. So for example, spiders were a large part of the diet of birds that were strict insectivores that were foraging in the understory, but not so much if they were omnivores. On the other hand, beetles were eaten widely by insectivores in the canopy, but omnivores in the understory, and then ants were a large part of the diet of omnivores foraging in the understory. So if you want to know how a bird is functioning in the ecosystem, you need to know their guilds, whether they're insectivores or omnivores, and then where they primarily forage is going to dictate what insects they're going to be consuming. If we look more specifically at different species of birds, this is the rufous-capped warbler, Basiluterus rufifrons. This is the adults, so males and females look alike, and then this is a young. And we looked at their diets throughout the year, so both in the wet season and the dry season, or like the summer and the winter. And what we found were the blue triangles represent the kinds of diets they had in the wet season, and the orange triangles in the dry season. You can see the orange triangles kind of grouped together and the blue triangles kind of grouped together. That shows that there is a seasonal effect on their diet, that in the wet season they consumed more of a certain kind of insects than in the dry season. And so seasonality is going to be important because the rains that come with the wet season potentially drive different kinds of insects in the community that the birds can then forage upon. So it gets complex what the birds are eating, but season is important. All right, so now I want to talk about the field of molecular scatology, and we're going to use 3 different case studies to talk about that. So molecular means looking at the molecules, in this case the DNA in organisms. So we all have DNA that comprise all of our cells. And scatology, ology means the scientific study of. So this is the scientific study of scat. And scat is a fancy word for poop. So basically molecular scatology is the scientific study of bird poop and getting the DNA out of the poop in order to figure out what, in this case, the birds were eating. which is really great. We can go into the field and we can collect adult and nestling birds, and we could get fecal samples from them, which is completely non-invasive. Birds actually oftentimes poop as soon as you pick them up right in your hand. I don't know if you scare the poop out of them or what, but you get their poop and you let them go. And then you can put their poop in these little vials with a buffer solution, and you can mix it all up so the DNA is preserved, and you can bring it back into the lab and you can extract the DNA. And then you can amplify the dietary components in the DNA, in this case insects or arthropods, and you can figure out what they were eating, oftentimes to the species level. So we collected 237 fecal samples from adult and nestling western bluebirds in California vineyards, and we looked at what they were eating. And so western bluebirds, we think, have a strong possibility of being beneficial to growers. First of all, they nest in these nest boxes that you can put up in California vineyards. Here's a bluebird nest with little blue eggs. And here's a male bluebird and a female bluebird. They look a little different from each other. The male's more colorful. But they forage right on the grapevine. So low in the vegetation, they'll glean from the vegetation. They'll hover and jump on the ground in order to find food. So a potential to eat a whole variety of different potential pest insects. And so what did we find? We found that for every fecal sample, we found about 3 different prey items. And we found 66 different prey species that were consumed by these birds. And those insects were in 6 different orders and 28 different families. Every line here is a different fecal sample, and the different colors just represent a different identity of that fecal sample. So it's really showing you the birds eat, in this case, a rainbow of different insects in the California vineyards. And one thing we found as a result of this research is that these bluebirds are eating a lot of mosquitoes. So Aedes species, Culicidae, this was actually the most common prey item. Over 51% of adults and 49% of all nestlings had mosquito DNA in their fecal samples. And what's neat about this is we found this out through molecular scatology, and this was a previously unknown prey item, but it was the most common prey item. So actually putting up bluebird boxes in your agricultural lands will likely lower mosquito populations since they eat them so much. We also found out, interestingly, that birds fight back against parasites that try to suck their blood. So these are called ectoparasites. They're parasites on the outside of birds. And so here's one of my helpers holding a nestling who's alive, but you can see that there are these 2 larvae on it that are sucking its blood. All right, these are called bird blowflies, and they are just part of nature. They attack birds. That's how the blowfly lives. Their larvae suck the blood of birds, then they pupate, and then out comes an adult. And so it was often thought that these birds were completely helpless, and they just sat there and they let these flies suck their blood, and it was this really bad life. But what we found out as a result of this research was that actually the birds eat these blowflies. So we're not certain whether adults eat the larvae that are consuming the blood that might be on their nestlings, or whether they're eating adult flies since they all have the same DNA, but that this was a wide foraging strategy. So 6 different nest boxes at 2 different vineyard sites and 5 different vineyard blocks. We found ectoparasitic bird blowfly in the diets of western bluebirds. So our real question, though, were, are birds functioning as natural enemies of herbivores or as intraguild predators? And if you look at this chart here, all of the orange are when the birds ate herbivores. So they were functioning as natural enemies, and the herbivores could likely be pests. So widely you see that orange is in this depiction. They were widely eating herbivores, functioning as natural enemies. If they were consuming as intraguild predators, they would have eaten things that were purple, and you can see that's very uncommon. So these bluebirds are predominantly consuming herbivorous insects, which could help the plants. One interesting thing we also found out from this research is we found no consumption of spiders. And so birds were really predominantly eating the larvae of lepidopteran pests and other herbivores. And Intraguild predation represented only 3% of the dietary items. So by adding bluebird boxes in your vineyards or your agricultural lands, or by increasing the diversity of birds that come to forage, you're actually creating win-win conservation scenarios. So growers can benefit by putting up songbird nest boxes in their vineyards. They can benefit because it reduces the herbivorous pests in their vineyards. And the birds benefit by having places to nest and raise young. And so we can use agricultural lands to help conserve bird diversity. All right, so let's take this to another agricultural system. Do we see the same thing if we were looking in coffee farms in Kenya? So I had the pleasure of receiving a grant from the National Science Foundation from 2017 to 2020 to look at the role of insectivorous birds on pest predation in Kenyan coffee farms. And this grant allowed me to bring 4 different Missouri Western students to Kenya to conduct field research in birds and insect relations in coffee farms. And so a little look on where Kenya is. It is a country in Africa, and it is in eastern Africa, bordering Uganda and Tanzania, and Ethiopia is to the north, Somalia to the east. So here is Kenya, and our research was done mostly in central and southern Kenya in the coffee farms. So just like other research, we put up these mist nets, and mist nets are an easy way to capture birds. Birds don't really see them. Here's one of my students, Chris Watson, behind a mist net taking a bird out. We put them in these breathable brown paper bags. They leave us a fecal sample in the brown paper bags, and then we can band them to know that we caught that bird and release them. And then we take the fecal sample and we look to see what it can tell us about the bird diets. And so here are some of the birds that we caught in the coffee farms. So here I am out in the field with our fabulous Kenyan investigators from the Ornithological Institute and the National Museums of Kenya. Here's Frank Juma and Edson Mulambo. And we caught some amazing bird species, sunbirds, African paradise flycatchers, some amazing kingbird species. And we were looking to see, are they consuming one of coffee's major pests? This is a coffee fruit, and it has this little pest, this beetle that bores into the fruit and can kill and devour the bean inside, which is what we use to make coffee, so it can destroy coffee yields. And then there's some ants that are problems. So we wanted to see if birds were eating these in the coffee farms. So here is our field vehicle going out into the coffee farms. It's less shade trees than where I worked in Mexico, but it still has some. And so we're looking at whether different shade trees have different diversity of birds, which would then affect what they're eating in these different coffee farms. And so here are some of the birds we caught and how many fecal samples we were able to obtain from different individuals. So here we have the bird names on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the number of different fecal samples we got. So our main bird species we caught were streaky seed eaters, but we also have Eurasian blackcaps, who are migratory. They breed up in Europe and fly all the way down to Kenya to overwinter, and some just amazing other bird species. So here are 2 students I brought just this last December 2019. Audrey Lindstedt and Bailey Romaker did a fabulous job capturing birds, getting their fecal samples, and bringing them back to our lab to figure out what the birds were consuming. And so that's where we are right now, actually, in this research. So we just went and got our last field samples in December, and we're in the lab and we're extracting the DNA, and we'll be sending them off for sequencing real soon. So stay tuned to figure out how these birds are functioning in Kenyan coffee farms. But that brings me to other research that we're doing actively on molecular scatology at Missouri Western Campus. And so this is a bird's eye view of Missouri Western Campus. So here's our circle, and this is 29, and here's Farron. And all these yellow dots are pairs of nest boxes that I've established on campus way back when I first got here in 2015. And by a pair of nest boxes, this is what I mean. This is Remington, where the biology department is, and other science departments like chemistry and math and physics. And we have wood boxes, so a cedar box, and we have this concrete mix box called Schwegler boxes that are really common in Europe. And we were looking to see if different bird species prefer to nest in different kind of nest boxes on campus or in different habitats on campus. And then we're going to look at whether they consume different insects in these different areas. So what we found from our 5 seasons of data now, from 2016 to just this last season in 2020, we find that we get a real seasonality of birds. So we get some black-capped chickadees that come really early in April and May to nest in our boxes. We have some eastern bluebirds that nest in April, May, June, and July, kind of throughout. And then we have house wrens that don't start too early, but take in later in the summer and occupy our nest boxes, produce young, feed those young, a whole bunch of insects, and then are able to increase bird populations in Buchanan County. And what we found were that eastern bluebird, for example, greatly prefers to nest in those concrete mix boxes. So they had 21 nesting attempts just in 2020 in the concrete boxes and 0 in the wood. And they were 52% successful at producing young in those Schwegler boxes, which they prefer. House wren doesn't really prefer one or the other. They can nest in a whole bunch and are moderately successful in both. So we've been able to gather fecal samples from eastern bluebirds and house wrens that nest throughout campus, and we are extracting DNA from those fecal samples as well. And we're going to see whether bluebirds and house wrens forage on different insects, if they have kind of the same ecosystem function or different ecosystem function, if they are consuming herbivores. Are the bluebirds at Missouri Western Campus also consuming a whole lot of mosquitoes and helping to reduce those populations to make our campus kind of easier place for humans to walk around, where we don't have to get as many bug bites? All right. Other things we're doing on campus with bird diversity are trying to increase wood duck populations. So we have 9 different ponds on campus, and by almost all of those ponds, or by the Ohlone Creek, I've established wood duck boxes. Here's a male and a female wood duck that's occupied a box. And we've been successful. We've had over 4 different wood ducks successfully nest and hatch a whole bunch of young from our wood duck boxes. And at 2 places on campus, we have purple martin colony boxes up. So here's one by the extension farm. We have another by the pond by our dorms. And purple martins are species of concern in North America. They actually do not nest in the wild. They only nest in human-made purple martin boxes or gourds. And so we're trying to increase their populations and invite them to campus as part of the diversity that would naturally be here. And we even have 2 owl boxes. So we're really hoping to get barn owls to nest in our owl boxes. Barn owls are listed as endangered in the state of Missouri, often as a result of people tearing down their old barns. They don't have places to nest as much. So we're monitoring those, and we have not successfully gotten a barn owl yet, but we have evidence that our boxes are being used intermittently by owls. So we have our fingers crossed for the future. And all of this research really comes together to show that Missouri Western is becoming a bird-friendly campus. So we've been increasing. Here are our nest boxes along a tree line. Here's some fabulous Missouri Western students that have been checking our boxes all spring and summer, every year since I've been here, for 5 different field seasons. It's a tremendous applied learning experience in the field for these students to be able to look at a box, watch nests being built, watch eggs being laid, to be able to hold young nestlings in their hand. Holding nestlings does not harm the birds, and it doesn't lead to birds abandoning the nest. It actually just allows us to be able to study them better and see how they fledge and come back year after year to nest here at Missouri Western Campus. This research has also brought students into my laboratory where they're extracting DNA. We're trying to figure out what birds are eating, which has important ecological questions and also helps to understand the conservation potential of different landscapes so that we can invite birds into different landscapes, including St. Joseph area, and encourage bird conservation both in agricultural lands and in urban environments. So I really want to thank all of the fabulous Missouri Western students I've had the pleasure of working with for the past 5 years of me being here at Missouri Western. I want to thank fabulous funding resources that have allowed me to bring students all the way to Kenya to conduct fabulous research with birds and insects, especially the National Science Foundation, International Research Experience for Students. Some of the other work today I mentioned was also funded by NSF Postdoctoral Research Fellowship in Biology. I really want to thank Missouri Western's Portal program, which helps support applied learning for students. If you haven't heard about Missouri Western Portal, please check it out and consider donating funds to support this fabulous program. And I want to thank Missouri Western's Biology Department for being such great colleagues and support as well. With that, I will happily take any questions. Feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear what you thought of the presentation and answer any questions you might have. Thank you for your time and have a great day.